and he was transfigured before them. Please be seated. I want to begin today with a scientific study that I heard some years ago on Science Friday on NPR. I've not forgotten this study because it says a lot about how mice act and perhaps how we act as human beings. We know there's not a one-to-one corollary, but it's worth paying attention. So in this study, whenever they would put a mouse in a new maze, the mouse's brain would fire continually from the moment that they were placed in the maze, sniffing, trying to find their way around the maze, the brain fully firing until at the end, finding the piece of cheese or whatever, and that reward. And there was a sense of total engagement in a new situation. But they found that the more they ran this maze and the more familiar the mouse became with the maze, something happened to the brain activity. At the beginning, there was always the firing of the brain as the mouse tried to assess if this was a new situation or not. But then, once the mouse realized that it was familiar, that he knew his way to the reward, his brain literally turned off. And he ran the maze on autopilot until at the end he reached the cheese and once again the brain fired. So in familiarity, in learning the maze, there was a burst of activity at the beginning and a burst of activity at the end, but otherwise the mouse just ran through the maze on autopilot. So I wonder what this might mean for us in this last Sunday of the Epiphany, right before Lent begins. How are we wired? How do we respond to old and new situations? What is Lent calling us to in terms of a new evaluation of our situation, getting our brains and our hearts firing so that we can see things anew? I think this has real implications for our everyday life. I was thinking of situations in my life. I'm sure you could do the same. But I was thinking of communication patterns, for example, with my family or with my friends. What are those kind of predictable cues that set me off in a particular direction, whether or not that's what the situation is calling for? And so I think in some ways we learn our environment, we learn certain cues and how to respond, and then we go on autopilot, even if we get off track, even if the reward isn't what it once was. And so that kind of examination of how do we speak with our families? For me, there's a classic trait I have that my family laughs about, and that is I speak with great confidence regardless of how well I know the subject. And so about halfway through, they start to smile because they know I'm in that zone of acting like I know the situation, and I don't always. And now that's kind of my reminder that, okay, wait, I have to figure out if I really do know what I'm talking about. Second, think of another thing that's every day. What do we eat? What do we drink? Sometimes those choices are doing us harm, but we're on autopilot. And what I've found, there's a great thing from recovery groups, which I've learned through my wife, Rachel, who's a therapist, which is called HALT, H-A-L-T. Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? And am I tired? Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And if those conditions are there, then there is susceptibility to not necessarily eating or drinking the way that is best for me. Another example of a human pattern. I also think it's true for political discourse. I think we've reached a point where we hear just enough cues to set us running on the maze and looking for that reward, that outcome at the end with people agreeing with us or disagreeing with us. And I think it would be good if we could look at our discourse, look at whether our brain is firing, and actually see things anew, see if a new response is appropriate. So those are just some examples of how this study with mice might be interesting for us to consider as human beings. Looking at the Transfiguration story for today, something new is definitely happening. Jesus is being revealed in a remarkable way. His clothes are dazzling white, as nothing on earth could bleach them. He's visiting with Moses and Elijah, the great prophets of old. In a sense, he's continuing the wisdom of his forebears. And then that voice, Once again, the voice from God, from the cloud, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." We have these ringing bells at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the middle of Jesus' ministry, and the end of Jesus' ministry. In a sense, God and the gospel writers and the tradition telling us that Jesus is set apart, Jesus is Messiah, Jesus is Son of God, the anointed one. So it's a brand new situation. And Peter is like us in that autopilot mode. He sees a new situation happening, but what does he do? He goes to the reflexes, he goes to the patterns that he knows. And so first of all, he calls Jesus Rabbi, which is very telling. He doesn't say Lord, he says Rabbi, which means he's still kind of in that earthly frame of how to understand Jesus. Second, he wants to build something. He wants to create a dwelling for Moses and Elijah to be comfortable. Again, great impulse, lots of hospitality, but not quite connecting his earthly location with this heavenly experience. And then finally, the voice from God. And so Peter, you can almost see him straining to know how to respond to a new situation. He's not wrong for that. He's not bad for that. He's us. That's us in the story. Are we perceiving when God is revealing God's self anew? Are we seeing when a new thing is happening that calls for a different response rather than the old, tired maze that we're accustomed to? I love Peter for that. Peter is the everyman. And then at the end, as they came down the mountain, Jesus said, "Don't tell anyone about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." And this behavior from Peter's not new. He did it the chapter before. When he first saw Jesus was Messiah, this new thing broke through. But then when Jesus told him what Messiah means, that he would suffer, he'd be handed over to his enemies, he would be killed, Peter couldn't grasp that. And he rebuked Jesus, and Jesus rebuked him in turn. Or in the very next chapter, these ones who went up the mountain and saw Jesus transfigured, they're the ones who the next chapter are arguing with each other about who is the greatest. It's tough to break old habits. It's tough to see in new ways. And that is what the discipleship journey is. It's a lifetime process of God calling us to a new response, a new way of being that is not on autopilot. Next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, is Ash Wednesday, and we begin the season of Lent. And many of you listening today, you know what Lent is. You know what the church classically describes this season as: a time of repentance, a time of going in a new direction, a time of studying God's holy word, a time of doing good works, right? That's the classical understanding of Lent, and we all like that. We appreciate that. But I want to take it one step further. I think what we're being invited to in Lent is an examination of our maze and an examination of our responses. And simply to recognize, to see when we're being triggered, when we're responding in an automatic way that may or may not be effective for the situation we're in. So Lent doesn't have to be burdensome. It is like higher attention. Am I responding and acting in ways that are consistent with the Christ? And the answer is going to be a lot no. And that's okay. Because every year we get to start again. Every year we get to do that examination. And I suggest to you that over the course of your life, you become more and more aligned with the God who loves us and calls us deeper into that intimacy. And so that's what the season of Lent holds for us. This Wednesday, we've changed things around. The weather in Dallas, for those who are not paying attention, it's a big deal. Snow and ice, and I know all of you folks in the northern realms, you're not impressed. But for us, this is a big deal. And so we're having to shift and pivot. And so Ash Wednesday looks like it's going to be as bad as it is today. And so we're shifting a couple of things. Our early morning service, 7:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. is going to be a drive-through imposition of ashes. I love it. The burger joints have nothing on us. You come, you drive through the porte cochere on the west side, the priest says a prayer with you, applies the ashes, and off you go. For those who need a little more than just the ashes, who actually want the liturgy of Ash Wednesday, which I think is one of the most powerful liturgies in the year, tune in at noon. We're going to do a full Ash Wednesday liturgy. We're going to do communion spiritually. And so I ask you to consider tuning in at noon so that you can receive that full Ash Wednesday experience. And if you'd like to receive ashes to apply on members of your household's head, just come by the church, go to the receptionist, and they've got packets of ashes for you. That's how we're going to get ready. That's how we're going to examine our lives this Lent. We're also going to be grappling with a particular theme, and it's called covenant, keeping our sacred promises. Now, I want to say, as one who has now been thinking of sermons and preparing podcasts, covenant is a tough word to get around because, in a sense, it can be highly spiritualized and we don't really know what that word means. Here's what it means. Covenant is deeper than contract, and covenant starts with God. That's really what's happening. It's much greater and deeper than contract, and it always is initiated by God. And so in this Lenten season at St. Michael, we're going to be thinking about and grappling, what does covenant mean in my life? Covenant with my spouse, covenant with my church, covenant with my God. And again, we're going to be called into newer and deeper ways of relating to the Christ, who is the Messiah. So what does all this mean for today? The bottom line is we get a chance, we get an opportunity to reflect on our behavior. That's what makes us different than other aspects of the animal kingdom. We actually can be reflective. We can actually change course based on new data. We can self-correct. And so we are remarkable in that way. We are made in the image of God. And I pray that we will avail ourselves of that very unique human capacity to reflect on our behavior and see if it's accomplishing what we intend. This story from Mark today tells us something essential about Jesus, who is the Christ. And this covenant relationship we're talking about begins and ends in the Holy One. And so pay attention to the story of the Transfiguration. Pay attention not only to what happens to Jesus, but pay attention to how Peter responds. And then see if over the course of your Christian journey, you can close the gap between what God is revealing and how we are responding. Transfiguration Sunday. Be transfigured, be made whole, and trust in the mercy of God. Amen.